bit, one of the things you wrote about in the book that came out of your dissertation was, in fact, the evolution of a method. How will you kind of deal with the material? Can you explain sort of how you figured that out, and what method has kind of meant for you?
It's meant, I mean, you can track, if there's one theme, well, as well as psychoanalysis, that you could track through my work, it's an enormous interest in method. And I am still as convinced as ever, or more convinced, that method is defining for what can be thought and known in psychology. And if you don't get your methods right, you get very inadequate visions of human being. And I think methods are, well, I think positivist methods were dire, because, I mean, that was the start of the critique. But I actually think qualitative methods are often very thin as well, particularly for psychology. And I think one of the things about the qualitative turn and the discursive turn in social psychology is that, in a sense, the ground of psychology has been given up a bit. I think it's turned into microsociology. And what that means is that we're not asking questions about human subjectivity as the central feature of what we do as psychologists. And, you know, I've done that, or rather I've failed to do that at times, but I've always had this abiding curiosity about what makes people tick. Back to that. And so I never really was happy to give that up, to talk about how people were positioned. So in my thesis, this idea of positioning in discourses was very strong, but it wasn't about discursive positioning only. It was about the investment in those positions, and that was about discourses of sexuality. And when that work took up, which it did get taken up in quite a lot of places, it got taken up as discursive positions. It got taken up as more deterministic. I'd always had a thread of psychology in there, and that was just what happened to social psychology for the next 2 decades or something. It became very social constructionist, very discourse determined. And that was not what I was doing, and I increasingly paid attention to that sort of psychological investment side of positioning. This is British social psychology, so it might feel a little bit sort of strange to you, but that's been, I mean, think of the work of Margaret Wetherell, who's one of my colleagues at the Open University, you know, absolutely so influential in bringing discourse into social psychology. And it was very necessary. But my position always was, and Margie and I have had more than a decade of friendly discussion about this, my position was that there wasn't enough psychology in discourse analysis.
Well, you've described your position as very deeply psychosocial. Can you describe or unpack that?
Yes, and I suppose I only started using that term about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And I'm not quite sure how it sort of emerged as the central thread, because before that it was critical psychology that we were doing. I think critical psychology as a cutting-edge term lost a little bit of its bite. And I think that's because if you're always critical, where are you building something new? You know, that negative critique was in danger of becoming too dominant in critical psychology. And now, I think I didn't then, but now I get really fed up with negative critique, actually. You can critique anything to death, really, if you really choose to, and that sometimes kills off, you know, potentially useful ideas. Anyway, so that was not the rationale at the time. That's a bit of retrospective thinking about it. There was a tradition of psychosocial. I mean, Erik Erikson was one of the people to use it, and his work had been kind of, the baby had been thrown out with the bathwater in Erikson, of the notion of stage. I think, you know, there was a critique of fixed notions of stage, and developmental stages, and I think he was kind of thrown out, but actually I think it's very rich. Now, again, it's not what I thought particularly then. I'd kind of not been paying attention to Erikson very much for years. I'm really just trying to remember why that term came to be so central. But I think these things are in the air. I mean, I know I've been quite central in using it and certainly in institutionalising it now in the last 5 years. But I think these things are around, and so somebody picks them up. And I certainly wasn't the only one. Stephen Frosch was very important in that. But it couldn't have been what it was without feminism. I mean, you know, if you look at the term now, psychosocial studies, it doesn't sound feminist, but it is, in the sense that the whole of feminist psychology has informed it. It's critical, you know, it's qualitative, all those things that had happened over the last 25 years or so. And of course there are a lot of women who either explicitly or implicitly are using feminist notions of gender and gendered power relations. I mean, they're so widespread in British critical social science. I mean, they're just everywhere. And that's interesting because you can just go a long way without ever having to say, look, I'm a feminist, or I do feminist psychology in this country. And I think that's probably different in North America a bit. In critical social sciences, you know, in leftish.
Right. No, I think you're right.
You know, and sociology and my kind of psychology really come together in the psychosocial.
Right.
So one answer to your question would be that it was a very determined attempt to be interdisciplinary.
Right.
And the critique that we developed in changing the subject was the awfully kind of unproductive nature of having sociology and psychology as two binary paradigms, so that, you know, when you talked about how they actually you know, informed each other in practice, you'd end up with some very unhelpful notion of interaction, where the social and the psychological were not, they were still thought as binary terms. And that preoccupied us in changing the subject, and we addressed it in various ways then. And I don't think post-structuralism actually solved any of that at all. It was just on the social side, ultimately. And so I suppose the answer is that that was a very, very central part of my critical psychology thinking. Feminism, or at least gender relations, was always the site, the territory on which I was thinking the problems, choosing the problems that interested me most. So that's why it was always gendered, I think, because of my own understanding of my own experience, which was always gendered, and there was always, you know, a very close affinity between my own experience and the themes that I found worth thinking about, writing about and researching.